Welcome to this week's installment of Live Teach Agriculture. We're going to be learning about rangeland inventory and monitoring. So let's get started. So rangeland management is the use and stewardship of rangeland resources to meet goals and desires of humans. And in order to make good management decisions, you have to know what the past management actions have been taken. And so that's kind of what that image there in the center is kind of showing the current management plus humans is going to lead in what direction for the future management of that area. Information for management. So inventory is really key in rangeland management. This is just like any inventory, it's a record of resources at one point in time. So in the case of rangeland management, we're talking about land area, pasture sizes, roads, trails, water, vegetation types, corrals, building, fences, all those sort of things that are available on the land or have been used with the land. Maps are also a management resource, so they're geospatially looking at vegetation, range, watershed. You've probably all seen watershed maps before, and then land ownership as well. If you're into hunting, you may use these land ownership to kind of see where the BLM, Forest Service, and private properties are. So those are also used. Assessment's another key part of management. It's the evaluation of a condition at one point in time. So this can be your riparian proper functioning condition. So how well is that riparian area doing in that range? Rangeland health overall, ecosystem integrity, and they usually involve protocols based on qualitative attributes rather than quantitative measures. So qualitative being quality, quantitative being a number. That's how they're typically being measured. Monitoring is rooted in the term meaning to warn. So monitoring is key in rangeland because it allows managers to take appropriate actions to change the course of whatever they're doing if needed. So, for example, this leafy spurge patch, such as this, could be monitored to determine if weed management plans are effective. So we see in the picture in the top that it was pretty invasive, covering much of the landscape, whereas down in the bottom, same area, a couple of years later on, basically the same picture, but we see that the leafy spurge population has probably decreased due to good management techniques. So the main steps, and these are key in monitoring for rangelands, you need to have a complete inventory. You need to know what resources are available. You also need to develop objectives. Just like we have here in the classroom, you need to know what you're trying to accomplish with the tasks or information that you're given. You then need to be able to design and implement a management or management plan. You need to design and monitor methodology. And then finally, evaluate your management actions. Are they working? Are they not working? What can you do to improve the situation? What can you do differently to help the plan go better? So here's an example of a planning strategy. This is what we call a wire process. And so it's just going between strategic, tactical, and then operational parts of process. And so it's just a big circle that you kind of work through and check off and see if everything is working. If something isn't working, you can come in, replan again, and start over and keep monitoring or remonitoring the situation that way. So here again is just a breakdown and the main steps of rangeland management. You can enter anywhere in here. Typically, you're going to start with your inventory again, go to your setting your goals, creating that plan, implementing your plan, evaluating your plan, and then revising your plan as needed. So it's just going in a big circle, checking how everything is going. So SMART objectives are used, and we talked about SMART goals in class a little bit. Remember, SMART goals are going to be specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time. So you got to have a time limit on everything, a time stamp on everything, so that you know and are able to evaluate how well your objectives are working, given that specific situation. So again, here's just a couple more examples. To set SMART objectives, you need to know what resources you have, what are you capable of, so your skills, abilities, knowledge, what your land is capable of, is it a good ecological site, how's the climate, what's the condition like, all those factors come into play. Once you have kind of a plan, you're going to start looking at the trend. So the trend is just like a curve, so it's upward or downward based on the conditions measured at least 2 points at a time. You can manage or you evaluate these to determine how well your management actions are, and the measures change over time. So it's best done if it's done frequently. So you want to be continually checking your trend. An apparent trend are attributes measured at one time point in time to infer the trend. So it's often misleading. It's like basing results off of one lab test. If you do that, you might have inaccurate lab results. And so you just always want to make sure you're checking multiple points in time instead of just one. So here's an example. Um, we have our trend, which is kind of our slightly curving line here, as well as our current status, which you can see is like going up and down. It's basically like looking at the market. If you look at the market right now, let's take cattle for example. The trend over time may seem very smooth, but currently it's all sorts of jagged peaks and troughs. So factors that influence your trend are weather, grazing and browsing, insects, recreation, fire, trampling, rodents. They can be beneficial, they can be detrimental, but it depends on the circumstances. So, for example, grazing and browsing. Remember, browsing is what elk and deer and wildlife typically do because they're eating browse, which is more of our woody plants instead of just grasses and forbs. Um, Browsing is also on Forbes too, though. So just kind of looking at how is it detrimental? Is it killing the plant population within that area, or is it actually benefiting it and bringing it back to where it's more manageable and we can have more grasses? So from all of this, we can interpret our data. That just means it determines if the management objectives are being achieved. If not, why? Why aren't they being achieved? Determining if the management objectives need redefining. Are they realistic? Did you set it too far out for what we currently have? Have goals changed? And then finally, redetermining your needed management action. Pictures are worth 1,000 words. This is always true, or most always true in rangeland, especially. You only need to know the true story of what happened over time. You need to know what happened over time. So photos are used by critics, but they seldom make the correct interpretation. So the permittee is the person most likely to know the true story, but you do have to get multiple stories in order to make the correct determination about the ecological site and what is happening there. So take it, look at the picture, assess the picture, but also gather input and data from the actual sources such as the permittees in a rangeland system. And this goes for most anything. So here's an example of rangeland management. As we can see on the left-hand side of the picture, we have more of a sagebrush, not as many grasses. So we can determine a lot of things here. We can see that probably we had livestock species such as cattle who ate down all the grasses while leaving the bigger shrubs. And then in the other side of the picture, we can probably say that we had species maybe such as goat or sheep that ate down most of the brush, but not as much as the grasses. So remember, different livestock species and different species of wildlife have preference in what browse or forbs or grasses that they eat. And so kind of having a combination between or having a multi-species operation is really key in managing a good rangeland. And that's kind of what this pictures kind of show here. So pictures are worth 1,000 words. All right, we're going to jump into measuring rangelands. So this is getting more into the technical side of what you would do in the actual business. We're just going to go through this pretty briefly. So again, uplands versus riparians versus wetlands. Uplands are your drier areas on landscape that are only wet for short periods of times after precipitation events. That's much of the range usually. Riparian areas are going to be along stream or creek areas, or adjacent to water surfaces. It can also be along shorelines, on lakes or reservoirs. The greener vegetation because of the water source, and so this is a preferable habitat for a lot of species of not just wildlife but also livestock. And then riparians have two classifications, lotic, which is associated with flowing water, and then lentic. So if you think of kind of like lazy, it's associated with standing water. Wetlands, very similar. They're actually areas with hydric soils that are permanently or seasonally saturated by water. So think of all your ponds and really marshy areas, that would classify as a wetland. So vegetation attributes are really key in measuring rangeland. So plant species or type, how often does that species occur? How dense of a population is it? Is it really dense? Is it not as much? The biomass, how much cover is there? Structure, all these come into play when measuring rangelands. Plant species or types. So plant species are genetically unique and closely related. There's grasses, grass-likes, forbs, shrubs, trees. There's all sorts of different types of life forms that we need to look at and consider. Frequency. This is how often a plant occurs within a sampled area. So the proportion or percentage of times that plant occurs in the total number of plots examined. So if you looked a couple slides back, there were people setting up these squares or rectangles, and you actually count every single plant within that of the same species. And over a large area, you can actually calculate how much of each species is there. Density is the number of individuals per unit area, so plants per square foot or plants per hectare. You can go however far you need to. Biomass is the total weight of living organisms, including plants and animals, for a given area. It's typically expressed in kilograms per hectare or pounds per acre, the latter being the one we use most often. In range assessment, it refers to just plants. It does not usually include the weight of animals per area, and it's determined by actually clipping and then weighing what is there. And it can vary substantially, right? From one area from the next, from year to year, depending on precipitation and different factors like that. It can really change how much the landscape or the rangeland is producing. Cover, so the proportion of ground surface covered by vegetation or other objects. It can include rocks, litter such as dead plant matter like leaves, moss, bare ground, and it's measured with points or plots. So these are different ways. That one, that's a square, that's what we would call a plot. And then we also have points, which are kind of like the other two images. This is just allowing rangeland scientists to better measure what's in the rangeland. Structure are 3D arrangements of a plant community. So it relates to hiding cover, thermal cover, and wildland fuels. So hiding cover for like wildlife and things like that. Thermal cover, same sort of concept. Wildland fuels, if there was a fire, how much fuel is in that area. Plant composition is a calculation based on the proportions of biomass or cover. So the proportion percentage of various plants or life forms in relation to the total plant biomass or cover. And so that's kind of what that chart there is showing. So we have sagebrush in the example picture. It's 150 pounds per acre. And we can see it's about 25% of the total composition of the area with inclusion of wheatgrass, lupin, and yarrow. So again, those are kind of those different vegetation attributes. We also added in composition. If you have any questions or anything like that, let me know. That was a down and dirty, quick explanation of rangeland management as well as measuring. They're more complex topics, extremely important and good to know about. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day. Thank you for joining me.